Do you ever catch yourself telling someone younger, "We used to memorize phone numbers," and they look at you like you just said you hunted your own food with a spear? Or maybe you feel a strange irritation when the Wi-Fi drops for 10 seconds, but at the same time, a tiny part of you feels relieved, like the world just exhaled. People assume that remembering life before Wi-Fi just means you're older, that it's about nostalgia, about cassette tapes, landlines, and waiting for photos to be developed. But psychologically, it's much deeper than that. If you remember life before everything was instantly connected, your brain was shaped in a fundamentally different environment. And that changes how you think, how you relate, how you tolerate boredom, and even how you define yourself. Let me show you what I mean. Imagine being 12 years old and wanting to talk to your friend. You had to call their house, a house phone, which meant their parent might answer, which meant you had to say, "Hello, Mrs. Smith, is John there?" There was friction, social risk, tiny moments of anxiety. But those moments trained your brain. They built what psychologists call social competence through exposure. You didn't curate your words in a text box. You performed them live. Now compare that to today. Instant messaging, typing, deleting, retyping, editing your personality in real time. Both systems have advantages. But if you grew up before Wi-Fi, your social brain developed under different pressures. You learned to navigate awkward silences, to read tone without emojis, to tolerate uncertainty. And that tolerance is key. Research in cognitive psychology shows that boredom isn't just discomfort. It's a mental training ground. Before constant connectivity, boredom was common. You waited in lines with nothing but your thoughts. You stared out of car windows. You lay on your bed, listening to music, doing absolutely nothing else. That nothing forced your default mode network, the part of your brain linked to creativity and self-reflection, to activate. If you remember life before Wi-Fi, you probably remember that feeling of drifting into your own head, imagining conversations, replaying memories, building entire fantasy worlds. You didn't escape boredom with a scrolling, you metabolized it. And that subtle difference may explain why many people from that era report a strong inner narratives, rich daydreaming, and a certain comfort with solitude. But here's the twist. You might also feel more overwhelmed by today's world because your nervous system was calibrated for slower information cycles. News came once a day, maybe twice. You couldn't check someone's location. You couldn't refresh for updates every 30 seconds. Your stress response system had downtime. Now, the same brain is bombarded with notifications, headlines, algorithms competing for attention. It's not that you're bad with technology. It's that your attentional system was wired in a different rhythm. Neuroscientists talk about neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt. Yes, you've adapted. Of course you have. But the foundational years matter. They set default thresholds for stimulation. And that creates an interesting psychological tension. On one hand, you appreciate convenience, GPS instead of paper maps, streaming instead of rewinding tapes. On the other hand, you sometimes long for the friction, the effort, the waiting, because effort gives experiences weight. When you had to physically go to a video store, choose a movie, and hope it wasn't already rented, the reward felt earned. Scarcity amplified value. Today, abundance dulls it. Psychologists call this the paradox of choice. When options are limitless, satisfaction often drops. If you remember life before Wi-Fi, you remember fewer options, fewer shows, fewer channels, fewer distractions. And strangely, that constraint may have increased your sense of presence. You watched what was on, you committed. You didn't half watch while scrolling something else. There's also something profound about memory itself. When information wasn't instantly retrievable, you stored more of it internally. Phone numbers, directions, song lyrics, trivia. Your hippocampus, the brain's memory center, was exercised differently. Now, we outsource memory to devices. It's efficient, but it changes our cognitive habits. Studies on digital amnesia suggest that when we know information is stored externally, we're less likely to encode it deeply. If you remember life before Wi-Fi, you may notice you still instinctively try to remember things instead of immediately searching. There's a subtle pride in recall, a satisfaction in saying, I know this without checking. But this isn't about superiority. It's about imprint. Every generation is shaped by its dominant technology. The printing press shaped literacy. Television shaped passive consumption. The internet shaped immediacy. Growing up before Wi-Fi means you experienced a transition. You lived in both cognitive climates, analog childhood, digital adulthood, and that dual exposure creates a kind of psychological bilingualism. You can sit quietly with your thoughts, and you can navigate online chaos. You know what it's like to disappear for hours and be unreachable, and you know what it's like to carry the world in your pocket. That contrast gives perspective, sometimes even skepticism. Have you ever noticed how quickly you detect when something online feels manipulative? Clickbait headlines, emotional outrage cycles. Maybe that's because you remember a time when information traveled slower and felt more filtered. Your brain has a comparison point. There's also identity. Before Wi-Fi, your social identity was largely local: school, neighborhood, family, friends. Your sense of self developed within a smaller mirror. Today, identity is global and performative: likes, comments, metrics. If you grew up without that constant external scoreboard, your self-concept may have been shaped more by direct feedback than digital validation. That can be a strength. You might feel less dependent on online approval, or at least you remember who you were before it existed. That memory can act like an anchor, but it can also create disorientation because you have witnessed a cultural acceleration that few generations experienced so rapidly. In one lifetime, the world shifted from dial-up tones to instant video calls. That speed can feel destabilizing. It can make you nostalgic, not just for youth, but for cognitive simplicity. And nostalgia itself is fascinating. Psychologically, nostalgia isn't just longing, it's a regulatory emotion. Studies show that nostalgic reflection can increase feelings of meaning and social connectedness. When you think about riding bikes until sunset without GPS tracking, or knocking on a friend's door without texting first, you're not just romanticizing the past. You're reinforcing a sense of continuity in your identity. You're reminding yourself, I existed fully before this. That continuity is protective. It stabilizes the self in times of rapid change. Let's talk about attention. Before Wi-Fi, multitasking was limited. You couldn't watch a show, text 3 people, scroll news, and respond to emails simultaneously. Your attentional muscle trained for longer focus blocks. That doesn't mean you can't be distracted now. Everyone can. But your baseline memory of sustained attention still exists. Have you ever felt frustrated at your own scrolling? Like part of you knows this isn't how your brain is supposed to feel. That internal resistance might come from those earlier neural pathways. They remember depth, they remember immersion, and immersion feels different from stimulation. Stimulation is quick, bright, addictive. Immersion is slower, deeper, more satisfying. People who remember life before Wi-Fi often crave immersion in books, in conversations, in hobbies, not because they reject technology, but because they have tasted a different tempo. There's also resilience in delayed gratification, when you had to wait a week for the next episode, wait days for a letter, wait hours to download a song. Your brain practiced patience. Delayed reward strengthens self-regulation circuits in the prefrontal cortex. Today, instant gratification is the norm, but that earlier conditioning may still give you an edge in persistence. You might notice you're comfortable with slow progress, with building something over time, with not needing immediate feedback. And here is something subtle but powerful. If you remember life before Wi-Fi, you remember being unreachable, truly unreachable. No one could demand your attention at all times. That created psychological boundaries by default. Today, boundaries must be actively constructed. You have to silence notifications, set limits, opt out. But you have a reference point for what mental space feels like. You know the texture of it. That memory can guide you back when everything feels too loud. So what does all this mean? It doesn't mean one generation is better than another. It doesn't mean technology is harmful or that the past was pure. Every era has trade-offs. But if you remember life before Wi-Fi, your brain carries a unique map. It knows a slowness and speed, scarcity and abundance, privacy and hypervisibility. And that dual awareness is not a weakness. It's a cognitive asset. You can choose when to engage and when to unplug. You can teach younger people that boredom isn't an emergency, that silence isn't empty, that waiting isn't wasted time. You can model depth in a culture of distraction. Maybe that's the real psychology here. It's not about missing the past. It's about integrating it, letting the part of you that grew up without constant connection inform how you live with it now. You don't have to reject modern life, but you also don't have to surrender your attention completely. You remember what it feels like to think without interruption, to walk without tracking your steps, to talk without documenting it. That memory is a resource. So the next time someone jokes about back in your day, smile, because your day trained your brain in ways that still matter. It gave you patience, perspective, a built-in contrast filter for chaos. And maybe, just maybe, remembering life before Wi-Fi isn't about nostalgia at all. It's about balance. If this resonated with you, I'd love to know what you remember most vividly from that pre-Wi-Fi world. Was it the quiet, the waiting, the freedom of being unreachable? Share it in the comments. And if you're curious about how your brain adapts to the world around it, stick around. There's a lot more to explore about the psychology shaping all of us, whether we grew up online or not.